Friends, why don't you take your seats?
Hello, welcome to North Coast this morning. I wonder if you saw this video during the week. I think we've got a screenshot. This happened in the US as a skier was skiing downhill and he kind of went past this set of trees and saw this snowboard lying in the snow there. So he goes over to investigate. Turns out there was a snowboarder attached to the snowboard, and he had fallen, like kind of flipped upside down and landed in such a way that kind of around the base of trees you had these tree wells that kind of trap pockets of air. And he'd fallen and all the snow had collapsed in around him and trapped him there at the base of this tree. And you watch this video and this skier just starts frantically scraping away the snow, trying to find the state of this guy at the bottom. Really just incredible stuff. He's there upside down, kind of his full body length kind of down in the snow, just waiting, I guess. Who knows what he's thinking as he's there, trapped under the snow. Can you imagine how he feels waiting there? Can you imagine how he feels, that sense of relief, of joy, of thankfulness as he hears this guy arrive and start to dig him out? It is a gripping video to watch. And there's this moment where he kind of breaks through. You can see it there where he kind of finds this guy right at the bottom of this hole that he's dug. And here on Good Friday, you would have heard it in the songs that we sang. Good Friday is about a rescue. We call it a rescue, but it is a strange rescue, isn't it? If you had GoPro footage of that first Good Friday, it wouldn't look anything like that video. The events involve a flogging and an execution. And if you're new to church, maybe that feels weird. I think it ought to feel a little bit strange that is something that we're here to celebrate, Dan said. Maybe you've been invited along this morning. Maybe you're keen to investigate. What is this Easter thing that Christians celebrate? Because it does feel a little strange to consider the actual facts of the event. It is gruesome. And it looks like a failure. It doesn't look like a successful rescue. But in that reading that Sarah read out for us, there is a breakthrough moment, a point where we kind of get this rescue happen. And that's what we want to look at this morning. That if we understand the spiritual reality of what's happening here, we will see a great rescue taking place. And to know the Easter story like that, I think will have you leave here with relief and joy and thankfulness. So come with me, whether the Bible is something that's new to you or whether it's something that you have looked into for years. We're going to make sense of the Easter story right from the source here in the Bible from Mark's Gospel. And we're going to unpack it in two sets of pairs, two pairs of images, sets of things that go together to explain what's happening here at Easter. The crown and the cross, the cry and the curtain. That's where we're going. So, firstly, the crown and the cross. Before we get to Jesus' execution on the cross, Mark wants to show us Jesus' crown, this crown of thorns that is given to him. Crucifixion was one of the cruelest forms of execution, really, that history has ever seen. And yet, as Mark retells the story, he doesn't really focus on the physical details. His focus is on the mockery. Take a look in these verses. Verse 16, the soldiers led Jesus away to the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" These Roman soldiers think, great, we've got this Jewish guy here. We can just make fun of him. He's a joke. They dress him up. Look at this guy. He's a king. Look, I'll give him a crown. What have we got here? Let's get some sticks, make a crown for him. He is a joke to them. And so they mock him. But here's the thing that Mark is trying to show us very subtly. The thing is that he is the king. He is the king. Mark has been trying to convince us of this from the very beginning. Here's the first line of his biography of Jesus. It starts like this: the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Mark loads us up at the start with this information. Jesus is the Messiah. The Messiah is is the name for the Jewish king, the one who will rule God's people. And all the way through, Mark has been showing us Jesus' credentials, his miracles, his teaching with authority. But the really distinctive thing that a king was meant to do in the ancient world, they were meant to be a defender. They led the army, just like how the American president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That was the idea. The king, the Messiah, was a rescuer who would go out and defend his people and defeat their enemies. But if Jesus is him, he's not doing a very good job, is he? He's meant to be the saving king. But here he is being beaten, being mocked, wearing a crown, but a crown of thorns. And so you think, what kind of king is that? And of course, that's what the Romans think. What kind of king is this guy? The soldiers mean it as mockery. But here's the irony, right? They have hit the nail on the head. He is the king. The thing is, Jesus is crowned through the cross. He is crowned through the cross. And we already know that he is that kind of king from earlier in Mark. Jesus is not your normal king. He's a king who serves, a king who suffers. Here's what Mark chapter 10 says, verse 45. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. As a ransom for many. His death is a ransom. That's how to make sense of it as a rescue. Because you know how a ransom works, you know? It's a hostage situation. Someone is being held captive and a ransom is paid, and then that captive is released. That's how a ransom works. You sometimes hear about prisoner exchanges happening. We had one in the US recently that the US basketballer Brittany Griner was released from Russia, and in exchange the Americans released an arms dealer who had been held over there. And that's what's happening here at Easter. Jesus' death has this purpose to it. He is the ransom. He is the one. He gives his life as the payment. You see it in the way that Jesus takes the place of criminals. In verse 27, they crucified two rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. He's right there in the middle of rebels. It's a sign that something else is taking place here. The one innocent man dies. And it looks like a failure, but it's actually a ransom, taking the place and exchange for people who deserve punishment. But really, that is the question of Easter. Do you see yourself as a rebel? Do you see yourself as a rebel? Because I think a lot of the time it's hard to see ourselves in that light, because we never like to see ourselves in a negative frame like that. And often, you know, if I think about the people that I meet walking around the streets of Perth, most of the time they're great. Hopefully that's you. Hopefully you're one of those lovely people that I meet, that you've come here this morning and you try to live a life that is honest and hardworking, kind to the people around you. But the Bible says that the problem is that we are all running alternative governments. We are all rebels, revolutionaries in God's world. Because sure, we kind of try and do the right thing, but we live by our own standards. And we decide for ourselves what is right and wrong. And sometimes we get that right, and sometimes we get that wrong. But in every case, it doesn't honor the God who made us. And we don't live our lives in relation to Him. And the Bible says that is rebellion. But it is the kind of rebellion that Jesus dies as a ransom for. He dies between rebels, showing that He will take the place of those who deserve punishment. But of course, the Roman soldiers don't know all that. To them, He is just a failure. He is a joke. But Mark wants to show us that Jesus is king precisely because He dies like that. And He highlights it with the irony of the situation. And lots of people in life, they struggle with the concept of irony. There's even a website you can go to. It's called isitironic.com. You can check it out later. Basically, you can go there, you can write up something if you think it's ironic, and then people can vote on it as to whether they think it's ironic. It's not the most popular form of social media, but it is out there. You go to isitironic.com and find out that 68% of people think it's ironic if you get run over by an ambulance. I feel like it should be higher than 68%, but there you go. Irony is this mismatch between what you'd expect and then what you find. This mismatch between what is said and what is reality. And you see it there in the insults. They say, He saved others, but He can't save Himself. But can you see the irony? See, they can't see the truth of it. That the way He's going to save others is by not saving Himself. By acting as a ransom, as a prisoner exchange. His death wasn't Him failing. It is exactly the thing that makes Him the saving King. He is crowned through the cross. And you can't make sense of Easter unless you put those two things together, the crown and the cross. The next pair of images we get are the cry and the curtain. First, the cry there in verse 34. It says, and at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's actually quoting the opening line from a song in the Old Testament. It's from Psalm 22. And it's a cry for help. It's a song of mourning. It's a song about when everything in life is just turning against you and you just feel like God has forgotten you. And Jesus cries out like that. Like there's this huge black wall in front of Him. And God is not there and He's not listening. And He just feels abandoned. And these little bits of Psalm 22 happen to Jesus all the way through. As Mark tells this story, the insults, the way that the soldiers throw dice, cast lots for His clothes. They're all lines from this song, Psalm 22. And they're reminders that Jesus is like the person in this psalm, feeling cut off from God. But why? Why does Jesus experience that? Why does he feel forsaken by God? If he is the one who is sent from God, the one who alone deserves that perfect relationship with God, he is the one somehow forsaken. Well, to understand why he's feeling like that, we need to understand the curtain. The curtain, it's the other image that goes with this pair. The curtain tells us that we are cut off from God. In the Old Testament, the temple was the place where you would go to meet with God. The place where it was said that God dwelt. And yet the whole architecture of the temple told you that you couldn't just kind of wander up to God. No. The sin, the rebellion of the people made that impossible. And so approaching God wasn't this easy thing. Approaching God is fine if you are righteous, if you are perfect. But if you're not, to approach God is actually to approach judgment. And so the temple is kind of built with this reality in mind, and it had these different zones, and you had to perform these special sacrifices and rituals in order to cleanse yourself, and only certain people could approach on certain days to certain places. And it was all showing that we are cut off from God because of that rebellion. And the curtain was a picture of that distance. And it was huge. This curtain was 12 meters high. It was 10 centimeters thick, about as thick as your hand. And it was this solid reminder that we are cut off from God. And the only way to approach him is through a sacrifice, through blood being shed. And to see Jesus' death through that lens is to understand what is happening. That Jesus' death is that sacrifice that opens the way for us to approach God. He experiences that sense of abandonment by God instead of us, those who deserve it. He stands in our place as the sacrifice, being abandoned instead of us. Jesus is abandoned to give us access. A number of years back, this is going way back in time now, the National Australia Bank held a promotion for the AFL Grand Final, and it was called the NAB Stand-In. And here's one of the kind of newspaper ads for it. Basically, the deal was you entered the draw, and if your name was pulled out, then you won a complete Grand Final package to go to the AFL Grand Final, premium seats, food and all the works, tickets to get there. And the National Australia Bank would provide a stand-in for you. So someone who would go and stand in for whatever obligations that you had already booked for that day. And so they would do your thing and then you would be free to go. And so these stand-ins, I think they were bank employees, they had to go all over Australia. One had to be a radio DJ for the day. One had to be a beekeeper, a dog groomer. One stand-in even had to give a speech for a 21st birthday party. Imagine you're that friend and you just got this random bank employee giving you 21st. I think it's a marvelous little promotion. But that captures the essence of what is happening at Jesus' death. He stands in our place. He stands in our place. And just like the grand final, we are free to go, free to have this access with the Father while he is abandoned. You see it in the way that the curtain is torn in two at the moment of Jesus' death. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. God does this thing. And this is the moment of rescue. This is the moment of breakthrough. Darkness has fallen over the land, and God's judgment is being poured out on Jesus. But it is then that we see the great rescue take effect as the curtain is ripped apart. This barrier between God and us, this curtain that kept people away, gets ripped into. And it is the moment of relief, of joy. And that old system of the temple where you needed to make sacrifices in order to approach God, that is over. Jesus himself provides the one and final sacrifice. So we are free to approach God with confidence. And it's like that moment in the video where you finally see the guy kind of find the helmet of the snowboarder down at the base of this tree. And the light comes streaming into him, and the fresh air, and finally he gasps. And as you read through the story, it's at that moment that finally someone says something that is not ironic. Finally, someone authentic who can see this thing as it really is. Someone who recognizes in Jesus what is going on. You see it there in verse 39. It says, when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. And there's something about that reaction coming essentially from this bystander, a Roman, someone whose job it was just to manage, just to oversee this execution. He senses something, whether it's in Jesus' cries, the way that he is on the cross, whether it's in the strange darkness that has descended. He notices that written charge placed on Jesus, King of the Jews, and he thinks, I don't think that's mockery at all. In fact, he sees it as something even more. Surely this man was the Son of God. He recognizes the thing that we have been waiting for. All the way through Mark's gospel, we have been waiting for someone to recognize that Jesus is not just the Messiah, the saving King, but the Son of God, come to rescue people who are far from God. And in the way that this centurion recognizes the truth of the situation, I think we can't help but see that it throws the question onto us. What do you make of Jesus? What do you make of all this Easter stuff? A man dying on a cross. How is that a rescue? A man being abandoned by God, is that a good thing? Can you see that? Can you see that even though it feels like a failure, the great irony is that it is only by dying that Jesus is able to take our place as a ransom, to experience God's anger at our rebellion for us, and by doing that, be a rescue for us. Can you see that irony? And can you see your own need for a rescue like that? Because really that's essential. You won't think Easter is much if you don't think you need help. Can you see your need for a rescue from that rebellion? Are you someone who feels a sense of that distance from God? Are you someone longing for a way to feel confident to approach God? The cross of Jesus offers that. And if you have a grasp of your own need, then you will find in the cross that sense of relief, of joy, and of thankfulness. The feeling of rescue that comes from the cross of the King who rescues. And what we're going to do now is we're going to spend some time really just rejoicing in that. We're going to share communion together. And as we share some juice and a little wafer, it's only a tiny thing, but it is a token, a way for us to remember Jesus' rescue on the cross. We're going to remember that Jesus gave his body and his blood as a ransom for us. But it's also a moment for us to acknowledge our need of Jesus, that we need a rescue like that. And so as we eat and drink, we are going to remind ourselves that we need Jesus' death to count for us. So if you're someone who's here today, maybe you've just been invited along, you're kind of checking everything out. Don't feel like